Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever paused to actually think about the invisible forces that determine exactly how much money lands in your bank account every month? Or, why a bank is totally fine paying you a certain percentage to hold your money, but then they'll turn around and charge you a wildly different rate to borrow theirs? Well, today, we're diving deep into the distribution of income through what is essentially a tale of two markets. On one side, we've got the labor market, where we earn our keep through wages. And on the flip side, we have the capital market, where money itself goes to work and earns through interest. It's this absolutely fascinating duality that literally drives our entire modern economy.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the economics of wages. Second, the power of collective bargaining. Third, the functions of interest. Fourth, nominal versus real interest. And finally, we'll wrap up with the theories of interest rates. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the economics of wages.
Okay, we need to start by establishing a baseline. We so often think of our paychecks as just the simple, one-off negotiation between us and a hiring manager, right? But they're actually governed by some pretty strict underlying economic forces. Let's talk about the money wage. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's that simple cash value you see printed right there on your pay stub or your employment contract. It's just the raw number your employer pays you for the services you provide. Simple enough to grasp for sure. But hold on, because here is where we really need to dig a little deeper. That money wage, it honestly only tells half the story. What actually matters to your day-to-day standard of living is your real wage. The real wage represents the actual physical goods and services you can buy with that money wage, plus any of those nice incidental benefits you might get from your job. See, as workers, we might hyperfixate on the big number on the check, but from a purely economic standpoint, the purchasing power of that money, the real wage, is absolutely crucial to understanding true wealth. Now, if we look at a classic economic graph, you'd see a point right in the middle. Let's call it point E. This represents the theoretical ideal. In a perfectly competitive labor market, meaning a market where all labor is completely identical and there are countless buyers and sellers, the wage rate is perfectly determined by supply and demand. At that specific equilibrium point, the wage equals what's called the marginal revenue productivity of the worker. What does that mean in plain English? It means the worker is paid exactly the value of the final bit of revenue they bring into the company. But let's be real here. We don't live in a textbook, do we? We live out in the messy real world, and the real world is largely made up of non-competitive labor markets. Unlike that theoretical ideal where all labor is just homogeneous, in reality, skills overlap, jobs require highly specific training, and we have entirely non-competing groups. I mean, think about it. A structural engineer and an entry-level fast food worker are operating in completely separate non-competing markets. Plus, wage disparities exist simply to compensate for non-monetary differences. Economists call these equalizing differences. A highly stressful or physically dangerous job naturally has to pay a premium just to attract workers. Throw in trade unions and massive corporate employers, and you get our incredibly complex, non-competitive wage reality. Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the power of collective bargaining. The economist Maurice Daub brilliantly captured the core essence of why workers even organize in the first place. He noted that trade unions are the obvious line of defense against the inherent economic weakness of individual wage earners. If we strip away all the modern politics for a second, functionally, a trade union is just a structural economic tool. It's a pragmatic way for workers who, on their own, have very little leverage to group together and negotiate on a much more even playing field. So the crucial question is, what happens when that playing field is entirely uneven? Say, for instance, when there's only one major employer in a whole town holding all the cards. In economics, this scenario is called a monopsony. Without collective bargaining, that single massive employer can easily pay its workers far, far below their actual marginal revenue productivity. And that right there is textbook economic exploitation. Collective bargaining acts to correct this specific market failure, effectively forcing the employer to pull the wage back up to match what the worker is actually producing.
And it's fascinating to look at how they actually pull this off at the negotiating table. The famous economist Paul Samuelson outlined 3 very distinct methods unions use to boost those wages. Number 1, they can restrict the overall supply of labor. Number 2, they can directly force the employer to raise the standard base wage through things like negotiation strikes or legally binding contracts. And number 3, they can actively create conditions that shift the employer's entire demand curve for labor upward.
All right, moving right along to Section 3, the functions of interest. Now, interest isn't just some annoying fee a bank tacks onto your mortgage. It actually serves a massive, absolutely vital function in a market economy.
At its most basic level, it's simply the payment for the use of money. But if you zoom out to a macro level, interest acts as this invisible, highly efficient referee. Because funds for investment are incredibly scarce, the interest rate actually dictates who gets the money. Only the most remunerative, highly profitable projects can actually afford to borrow at high rates. This completely eliminates the need for arbitrary, subjective decision-making by some central government authority. The market itself decides based on who can generate the most value. But of course, there isn't just one single universal interest rate floating around out there. They vary widely. Ever wonder why your bank is thrilled to pay you 5% on your savings, but then turns around and charges you 18% for a car loan? Well, it all boils down to variables like the underlying risk of the loan, the duration of the borrowing period, the purpose of the funds, and critically, who is actually doing the borrowing. A stable government issuing a treasury bill pays a much, much lower rate than a private, unproven company issuing a debenture. Why? Simply because the risk of default is incredibly different. Let's dive into Section 4, Nominal versus Real Interest. First, let's get our definitions straight. The nominal rate of interest is, quite simply, the sticker price. It's the quoted percentage return per year paid on a loan. It's that big, bold number you see shining in the window of your local bank branch. But, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, this nominal number is entirely blind to the actual purchasing power of your money in the broader, real-world economy. When we actually sit down and do the math, a completely different picture emerges. Imagine you lock your hard-earned money away for a 10% nominal return. Sounds pretty amazing, right? But wait, if the general price level in the economy is rising rapidly, let's say inflation is running hot at 8% per year, that inflation is quietly, invisibly eating away at your returns. You have to subtract that 8% inflation from your 10% nominal rate, leaving you with what? A real rate of interest, your actual tangible gain in wealth of just a tiny 2%. And here is where we enter what economists call the danger zone. What happens when inflation actually spikes higher than your nominal rate? Say inflation jumps to 12% and your bank is only paying you 10%. Your real rate of interest turns negative. You're effectively losing purchasing power just by keeping your money sitting in the bank. When an economy hits this critical point, savers just stop saving, and that can severely threaten a country's entire capital stock. I mean, think about it. Why save if your money literally buys less tomorrow than it does today? Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Theories of Interest Rates. Historically, understanding where these rates come from sparked a massive debate that basically split economists into two main camps. On one side, we had the real theories, which were championed by the old-school classical economists. They looked at physical reality, arguing that interest is the income derived from capital. They believed it was driven by the real, physical productivity of machines and factories and the human psychological abstinence of choosing to wait to spend your money. On the flip side, modern economists pushed monetary theories. They argue that interest isn't about physical capital at all. Rather, it's a purely monetary phenomenon governed strictly by the supply and demand for cash itself. On the classical and neoclassical side of the ring, we had some serious intellectual heavyweights. Thinkers like J.S. Mill, Baumgartner, and Irving Fisher spent their entire lives trying to formulate exactly how capital generated returns. The earliest theories, like the marginal productivity theory, focused almost entirely on the demand side of the equation, basically looking at just how practically useful the capital was to the producer. But it was economists like Irving Fisher, along with Alfred Marshall, who really brilliantly tied it all together into the demand-supply equilibrium theory. They basically said, look, you absolutely need both sides of the coin. The demand for capital is driven by its physical marginal productivity, like literally how much extra money a brand new tractor can make a farmer. But the supply of that capital, that's driven by psychology. It's the waiting or abstinence of the marginal saver who actively decides to delay buying a luxury item today just so they can lend that money out instead. And then, a true disruptor entered the chat, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes sparked an absolute revolution in the field by completely rejecting the classical loanable funds approach. He argued, boldly, that interest rates aren't actually determined by physical tractors or factories at all. Instead, he introduced this groundbreaking concept of liquidity preference. According to Keynes, the interest rate is entirely determined by why people want to hold on to liquid cash in the first place. Keynes broke our desire to hold on to cash down into three very distinct motives. First up, the transactional motive. You just need cash on hand to buy groceries and pay rent. Second, the precautionary motive. Everyone needs a rainy day fund for those unexpected emergencies. Both of those are pretty directly tied to your income level. But the third piece of the pie is the speculative motive. And guys, this is where the magic really happens. Investors hold cash specifically to speculate on future bond prices and interest rates. And this speculative demand, it has a direct inverse relationship with the rate of interest. When rates are high, people hold way less idle cash. But when rates are low, they hoard it like crazy.
So, from the incredibly messy realities of collective bargaining, securing our real take-home wages, all the way to the invisible hand of interest rates, allocating massive amounts of capital through liquidity preference, these two distinct markets fundamentally shape our entire world. Which leaves us with one final, pretty major thought to ponder today. Whether you're looking at your latest paycheck or checking your savings account balance, does the gap between your surface-level nominal perception and your real economic reality shape every single financial decision you make? Really think about that the next time you see a percentage sign glowing in a bank window. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the numbers.